Hi, it's 12:30, and we're going to start on time, knowing that some of our colleagues are going to come in a little later. I'm Kate Searles. I'm a research and policy analyst with Catholic Charities, and on the program and planning committee for Sensory Research Group. The normal things about the gathering. It's informal and supposed to be conversational, and be sure your cell phones are turned off. And then just to say 2 heads up about future TCRG groups. Our April meeting is about transportation finance database, and that's a deal large. Our May speaker is Maria Hanratty from the Humphrey Institute. She'll be speaking on, she'll, I think, be bringing her Keystone students, capstone students, who are doing a project on homelessness. And then our June meeting is on Tableau with James and Dave. Oh, I want to circulate this and encourage people to check your name off, and if your name's not on, please put your name and email on the back. So I'd like to introduce Jason Roby, who is a research associate with the Robina Institute. The Robina Institute, the research charities look to for information on criminal justice issues and public safety. He's working on the Probation Revocation Project and the Parole Release and Revocation Project. You see the BA from the University of Minnesota in Sociology of Law, Criminology, and Deviance, with a minor in African American and African Studies. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm Jason Roby, and I'll be talking to you today about probation research and the Robina's approach to it, which is interdisciplinary, multi-method, and multi-jurisdictional. So first, what is the Robina Institute? It was established in 2011 at the University of Minnesota Law School. It is funded by the Robina Foundation, which is a charitable foundation founded by University of Minnesota alumni James Binger, who's pictured there. And just a couple notes first, actually, about my presentation. So everything I say is not necessarily representative of Robina's views. This is kind of, I'll show you data that's from Robina and everything, but I might say my own opinions on these things and such. If you have any questions, I encourage you to ask them if they're short, small questions, or if you need clarification or a better understanding of any topic I'm talking about. But if you have any like bigger or off-topic questions, I'd ask you to wait until the end for those. And, that's everything we have there. If I talk too fast, just let me know. I kind of tend to do that. So what does Robina do? The Robina Institute is kind of a unique approach where they combine sociological and legal theories, practice, and policy to tackle these big problems in criminal justice, and to kind of look at it from every angle so we can see where everyone's coming at and what solutions are kind of common to everyone's goals. And so they try and partner with state and local jurisdictions to do coordinated research and policy analysis, and to kind of foster these relationships between everybody in the system. There's 3 main program areas at Robina. The criminal justice policy, which is led by Michael Connery, who's a world-renowned scholar in the legal field. Criminal law theory, which is led by Anthony Duff, and sentencing law and policy, which is where my projects fall, and which is led by Richard Fraze and Kevin Wright. And then these are the research projects that are currently going on at the Robina Institute. There's the probation revocation and parole release and revocation project. Those are the 2 that I work on, led by Kevin Wright, along with Ron Corbett for probation and Ed Ryan for parole. And we have the criminal history project and the sentencing guidelines resource center. The probation revocation project is what I'm going to talk to you today about. So my first kind of question is, why probation? A lot of people know that mass incarceration is a huge problem in the United States, but not many people know about probation. So what a lot of people think sometimes is that probation is an alternative to incarceration. Instead of sending somebody to prison, you send them to probation, which is a lesser sanction. But actually these rates of imprisonment and probation have been increasing at about the same rate. Since the 1970s, there's been a huge increase in probation, parole, and incarceration. So it's not really an alternative. So I have a question for you guys. How many people are in are on probation in the United States? Does anybody want to take a guess?
8 million.
8 million? It's a pretty high one. It's actually 3.9. So I was hoping somebody would say a number lower than that, but okay. How many are in prisons and jails? Anybody know about what that number is? About half that, 2.3 million. There's about 1 in 100 adults in the United States is in prison or incarcerated in some way, but about 1 in 50 are on probation, which is a very high number. And anybody want to take a guess at how many are on parole? Less than 100,000, or less than, it's about 850,000 on parole. So you can see that all three of these numbers are quite high. And so the idea that probation is an alternative to incarceration really isn't true. In fact, they're growing in tandem. All three of these populations have grown significantly since the 1970s. So it's not an alternative. Really, they're feedback loops between the three of them. And the main way that happens is through revocation. So you're on probation or you're on parole, you have conditions that you have, and if you fail to meet those conditions, you're at risk of being sent back to prison. And does anybody know how many of prison's admissions come from revocations like these? 75%. In combination, it's close to that number. For just probation, there we go. For just probation, it's about 1/3 of prison admissions. About half of jail admissions come from probation revocations. In the state of Minnesota, they don't have as good numbers on probation revocations actually as they do on parole. For parole, it's 1/3 of all the prison admissions in Minnesota come from parole revocations, and about 1/3 come from probation. So 2/3 of them are from just this revocation process. So you can see how it's kind of feeding back into that. And that doesn't necessarily mean that 2/3 of the prison population is from probation and parole revocations because their sentences are shorter, but admissions are. And does anybody know how the U.S. compares internationally? You probably know that internationally we have a much higher incarceration rate. But do anybody know about what it is for probation? It's a pretty similar disparity. You see the orange bars here on the left, mostly on the left here, are the probation rates for Minnesota, or for United States, individual states. So Ohio is the highest one there, 2,802 per 100,000. So that's 2.8 for every 100 people. And all of those blue ones on the far right over there, those tiny little bars, are European countries. So if you look at this, the highest European country is right here in Turkey. So the highest European country is still lower than the U.S. average, the states. And not just lower, but quite a bit lower. That little yellow bar on the far right over there is the European average. And that's about 300. The U.S. average is close to 1,600. You see we're about 5 times higher in terms of probation, which is pretty incredible when you think about it. We're higher in incarceration and in probation. So it's just the whole system is much larger. And were any of you have a good enough eye to see where Minnesota was at on there? I'm guessing not. We're 5th highest in the United States with a probation rate of about 2,600 per 100,000. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We do have a lower incarceration rate, so we do have higher probation rates as well.
That's per 100,000 residents?
Per 100,000 adults. So it's about 2.6 for every 100. 1 in 40. This is actually one of the few pieces of data I'll have in here that's not from Robina. This is information from the Minnesota Sentencing Guideline Commission. I made the chart myself, though. So this is the average length of probation in terms of months. You can see Hennepin County right there in the middle of that light blue one. That's 39 months, about 3 years. But here in Ramsey, it's almost 6 years is the average term of probation. You get out of state, you get some of these huge ones down here close to Mankato. Now they're at 119 months, which is 10 years on probation. This isn't necessarily how long they serve. This is what they're sentenced to. They can be released early for various reasons. So a little bit about the probation revocation project, how it's set up. First, we just kind of start with the legal framework of what the laws are in these various jurisdictions, so you can kind of understand how are these courts bound in their decision making. And then we move on to the alpha phase, where we go in and try and get a deeper look beyond that legal to see what actually is occurring in those places. Because you can set a statute that says you can only sentence somebody to 10 years, but do you actually meet that, or is there kind of like a informal max at 5 years or something? So that's what we kind of try and do in the alpha phase. We try and figure out what's really going on. We get statistics, quantitative and qualitative from those jurisdictions. And then we move, this is kind of a theoretical stage at this point, into the beta phase, where we go back to the same jurisdictions. We look at what we learned the first time and try and solve some of the problems that they see they have. So we'll start with the legal framework. There's this book I have here, published a couple years ago by Robina. It's a very thick book, about 21 states, and their legal examination of how they do probation in those states. We look at their definition of probation, the forms of it that they have, the length of terms, whether there's early termination available, supervision conditions, and what happens for revocations as well. And then we have a more specific one that was just published a few weeks ago, actually, specifically about the length of terms. And it's pretty surprising when you look at it. Well, not that surprising, I guess, for some. But, so these are the maximum length you can sentence somebody for probation for a felony offense. And so you'll see most of the states that we looked at are 5 years or under. But here in Minnesota, you might notice we're at maximum term, which means if you're sentenced to a felony, you can get the maximum amount of term you can get in prison is what you can get as a probation term. So for a lot of sentences, that might be 10 to 20 years. So you can see that we have we allow for these long probation sentences here in Minnesota. Another thing about the length of it is about whether you can be discharged early from your probation or whether your probation can be extended. So this is just kind of a little graph that shows you the various different ways that is defined in the statutes of these states. And you can see on this one that most of the time you can have early termination for cause. But that doesn't necessarily mean it will happen, it just means it can happen. And on the other one, you can see that the biggest two are that it can be extended for cause as well, or it can be extended just at the discretion of the court, which means they can decide whenever they want to extend it.
Excuse me, is that the distribution of the state?
Yep, that's the distribution of those 21 states.
So where's Minnesota in there?
Minnesota allows early termination for cause, and they allow extension for cause as well. Yep. I wasn't here when they did that, to be honest. But it is a pretty representative. They're all around. We chose the states that we're going to be doing our projects in specifically. So the states we want to go to eventually, we made sure to include those. We have Texas, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New York, and California on there. And then there's other states as well. And I have this book, you can look at it. It's a pretty representative of the United States, but obviously only half the states. So we'll move now into the alpha report, which is kind of the biggest, most expansive area of our project. So in the alpha report, we try to document the range of practice in several jurisdictions. And our goal is to identify practices that result in better outcomes for probationers. And this consists of interviews and gathering quantitative data. So these are the main quantitative data points. This doesn't necessarily mean this is what we get for every county. This is what we ask them for, what we try to find through reputable sources online. But this is kind of one of the issues that you have when you work with local jurisdictions, state jurisdictions across the country, is that sometimes they don't always keep this kind of data. Revocations is one thing that they don't have a lot of data on in a lot of counties. Especially if you go to a rural county, they might not even have the capability to record half of these kinds of data. But this is what we ask for, and we are able to get a lot of it in one way or another. Then we, yep.
So do you have demographics on the rolling?
On probationers, yep, we have some of that, and I'll show you that in a little bit.
Okay.
So, and we ask for that, and we get it in different forms as well. So that's another one of those kind of barriers that we have, is that our research is only as good as what we can get from these jurisdictions. Then we go on and we interview various people. Do you have a question?
Just very quick one. Maybe you said it. The data you're working with, are those non-public that you've been doing access to, or is it public information?
Most of the time it's not public.
Yeah.
I mean, you could technically go in and ask them for it if you wanted to, but you're probably not likely to get it unless you're working with us. So we go in and we interview people. We interview probationers themselves, probation officers, different attorneys, judges. We try and get as many perspectives on the system as we can. And these are some of the questions we ask them. So we ask them, a lot of times we end up kind of getting an overlap from all three of our methods. In the legal aspect, we ask them how long they can put a person on probation for. And then in the quantitative aspect, we ask, well, what is your average probation length? And then we ask again, when we actually interview them, what do you see the length of these probation terms as? So it kind of covers it from all three perspectives, so we can really get a full analysis of what's going on in terms of all these different aspects. So first we'll look at a county down in Texas, a very rural county, very small county, Bell County, Texas. And you can see where it is. It's right in the center of Texas, basically. So first about the legal context in Texas. So for felonies, their maximum term is 10 years. So it's a little bit shorter in Minnesota, a little bit longer than that 5 years we saw earlier, which is more common. For certain third-degree felonies, you can get up to maximum of 5 years. For state jail felonies, that's mostly like drug possession, it's 2 to 5 years, and for misdemeanors, it's up to 2 years. So those are pretty standard. And then we kind of look at also the criminal context. What are the particular issues that this county is having, or particular things that they are policing? And you look at the top one is Bell County, and the bottom one is the U.S. crime rates. So you can see they're a little bit higher on a lot of these things. Rape, murder, those are things you're not going to get probation for. But if you look at aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, that's just theft, those are the kind of things that are a little bit higher on. And then you look at, of the probationers in Bell County, what are their crimes? And so you can see, these are kind of the things you'll see in most counties across the United States. So a lot of them are DWIs and drug offenses, but then you also see some of these theft ones and assault charges, which were higher crimes in this area, so it makes sense that those are on this list. Supervision and risk levels. So this is of those probationers that they have, how many of them are directly supervised versus indirectly supervised. You can see it's about 3/4 of them are directly supervised. What indirectly supervised means is basically they're just on paper is what it's called a lot of times, administrative probation. So essentially they don't have any supervision. They might have a few minor conditions, but the main condition they have is don't commit any new crimes. And so essentially they're not being supervised. It's like they're living their own life, except the only problem is for 3 years they have this probation term. That means if they get a new offense, their penalty for having that new offense will be greater because they're already on probation. So it's just essentially another way to add punishment to them. Then those who are directly supervised, you can see where they fall in terms of high risk, medium risk, low risk. That's a risk assessment that they receive. Lots of states, there's different risk assessments across the U.S.
Is that risk of reoffense?
Yes, that's usually risk assessment and risk of reoffense. And there's a lot of controversy about what those really are measuring. It depends on the kind of risk assessment tool that they're using. They usually take into account, a lot of times they'll take into account marital status, their income level, various things, housing status.
Mental health.
Mental health. Mental health, yeah, it would be on there in some aspects, yeah. So it kind of just tries to get a sense of whether they'll reoffend. And if they're on high risk, they usually get more frequent supervision. They have to meet twice a month rather than once a month. If they're on those lower risk ones, they often have fewer conditions and fewer times to meet. So this is what you're talking about, the demographics. So you can see we actually got some pretty good data from Bell County. You can see the first bar is adult population, second bar is probationers, and then that third bar is those who are on probation who were revoked and sent back to prison. So you can see mostly young people, it's mostly males, and it's mostly African Americans as well. And it's one thing that I find most interesting about these graphs is it's pretty predictable that you're going to have more males being on probation. But then once you get to revocations, it's even more males. So it's just kind of another step up the ladder. You're getting even more disparities. And you can see it really with the racial demographics over there. You see 20% of the population is black. 40% of those on probation are black. And even more, 44% of those who are revoked are black. You can see, and for the age, pretty predictable. This is kind of common knowledge in the field of criminology that most crimes are committed by younger people. This is another area you see the kind of weird age breakdowns here: 18 to 19, 20 to 24, and then a 35 plus category, huge one. This is what we get from them, so this is what we have to work with. So it's another area where there's some data barriers. So what about revocation? What is the legal standard in Texas for revocation? So the court can revoke their community supervision when a preponderance of the evidence supports one of the state's allegations that they have violated a condition of their probation. What does preponderance of the evidence mean? Basically, it's a lower standard. Yeah, it doesn't really have any. It's a lower standard than if you're in a regular criminal trial. It's a pretty low standard. That's something we have heard, not necessarily in Texas, but we've heard elsewhere that, and this preponderance of the evidence standard is pretty common for revocation hearings. It's a very low standard to meet. It's much lower than proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
So the judge is the one who makes that determination?
Yeah, if it goes all the way to a revocation hearing, it can be handled before that. So essentially, if you violate a condition of your probation, there's a lot of different ways it can be handled. Some counties allow for the probation officers to handle them without going to court. So for minor violations, say you fail a drug test, they can handle that out of court by saying, I'm going to up the amount of treatment you need to do, or I want to see you twice a month instead of once a month, or I want you to do 2 random drug tests a week instead of 1. So that's the kind of thing that they can handle out of court sometimes. If it's a more serious violation, then they might go to court, and it might get solved in a preliminary hearing, like a plea deal in any other criminal case, or it might go all the way to a revocation hearing, and that's where the judge comes in, this preponderance of the evidence standard.
So in that case, it's more likely than not that they did at the court level. But if you failed a drug test, the probation officer then is not, in this county, does not have to prove any sort of evidence. They don't have to get it retested or any of that kind of stuff. Services.
No, with the failed drug test, it's failed most of the time. So that's one thing that's pretty clear, and it's not. I mean, that's pretty solid evidence. They could go all the way to a revocation hearing if they wanted to. Usually, if they just fail one drug test, they're
but
probably
the
not.
The person on probation doesn't get to decide if they want to go.
They could, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so if they meet with their probation officer and their probation officer says, you failed a drug test, I want you to come in more often, the probationer can say no, but they risk going to revocation hearing and potentially facing going to jail, so usually they would accept that. But kind of the idea behind handling out of court like that is usually that they try to give them a lesser sentence, or there's the threat of a greater sentence at least.
So of the cases that are headed toward court, and some have plea deals and some go before a judge, how does that shake out? Do most of them have a plea deal before they're in front of the judge?
So this is where you can see what happens actually. So most of the time, I would say we don't really have any data on how many go all the way to this court hearing or how many make it to this stage. I would say from what we've heard from the different people, criminal justice officials, Most of the time, it doesn't make it to this revocation hearing. These revocation hearings are fairly rare, at least in Hennepin County. Not quite as rare here, but this is, you can see, this was over 3 or 4 months. We had 153 hearings in 3 or 4 months. So that you can, they had a pretty high probation population, so there were a lot more violations and stuff going on. But there were only 153 hearings. So for these 153 hearings, you can see revoked and sent back to prison for more than 6 months. That was about 40% of them were sent back to prison for more than 6 months. About 30% of them were sent back to prison for less than 6 months. A couple of them were sent back to, or were reprobated, which means that their probation sentence was restarted essentially. They get 3 years from today instead of 3 years from when they were originally sentenced. And about 25% of them were dismissed. This could be, they were dismissed because that the evidence against them didn't meet that standard. So the biggest thing I think to note here is that close to 70% of the people who go to these revocation hearings are sent to prison. So they committed an offense that was originally put them on probation. Now they've committed some other sort of violation that gets them sent to prison. That may, so it's the combination of the two. Neither thing will get you sent to prison, but you do both of them, you get sent to prison. And the biggest thing here is these blue bars are what's called technical only violations. So these are things that aren't crimes. These are things that you violated the conditions of your probation. Maybe your condition is you must abstain from drinking alcohol. So you get caught drinking alcohol, you can potentially get sent to prison. Or you don't go to enough of your, you miss a couple of your meetings with your probation officer, you can get sent to prison. So it's kind of the scary aspect of the probation revocation system is that you're sending people to prison for things that aren't even criminal. I mean, they did commit originally a criminal offense to get them on probation.
What do you have a time frame for those for? Like, what was that sample taken from?
This was for like 3 months.
Okay.
Yep. And then so we go into the qualitative analysis. This kind of stuff comes from our interviews. So we asked them about probation conditions, and you can see that chart on the right kind of summarizes of all the people we interviewed, all the interviews, transcriptions, quotes that we have. Those are kind of some of the common things that they said. There's too many conditions. These conditions aren't personalized. So they're just kind of, they have a list of conditions that they just throw out and they give to everybody. No drinking at all, even if your sentence maybe not have anything to do with alcohol. So that's kind of where some of those problems arise. Probation conditions may interfere with employment. This is a pretty common thing you hear a lot of times about probation conditions. They have to meet with a probation officer while the probation officer is at work. So during the normal work day, we got to take a bus downtown to get there. So it takes time out of their work. Their boss probably isn't happy that they have to go do that. So conditions, and then it's not always negative though. Conditions of probation can be manageable. Conditions are usually explained well at the beginning. So there's a lot of different things that we hear from different people, which is kind of common in the criminal justice system. You have public defenders who want shorter terms, and you have prosecutors who want longer terms. It's kind of what you hear. These are a couple of good quotes that we heard from one official that said, the conditions used to be able to fit on one page, but both the number of conditions and the related fees have grown tremendously in the last few years.
And are these fees that probationers are paying?
Yeah, and I'll get to the fees in just a little bit too. And then another one said, this is from a probationer himself, who said that he thinks the probation officer should be able to go back and into the court and get some of those conditions removed if the probationer is doing well. This is something that you'll hear a lot about, is early discharge, and so we can talk about that as well. Length of probation terms. So these, and this is in Bell County again, they think that these terms that they have may be too short. So they have the maximum they can set is 10 years. They might want a little bit longer than that, it seems like. The ability of probationers to petition for early release, as we're talking about, serves as an incentive, and they see the good things. So it seems the combination of those two means that they kind of want these longer sentences that they can shorten if the person's doing well, but they want to keep them on for a long time if they have to. And this is another common thing that you hear a lot of times, is that they think they know in the first couple of years, within a relatively short amount of time, whether this person is going to violate and be sent back to prison. So that's a pretty common thing. It's held up by a lot of studies that show that your highest risk of reoffending is about a year out, and after that it could decline dramatically. Yep.
Is there any data analysis when you look at the states with longer and short probation periods about those recidivism?
No, we don't have that kind of data. That's pretty hard data to come by. Recidivism rates and stuff like that are pretty hard to come by. But when we did when we looked at the 21 states, we just looked at the legal statutes in those states. We didn't look at any sort of data about their crimes or recidivism or probation rates or anything. That was just what is the legal kind of understanding of how probation works in these states. And so now we get to fees and restitution. So this is something that varies drastically across the U.S. and whether probationers have fees that they have to pay. Restitution is a pretty common thing. You have to pay a certain amount of money back to whoever you stole from, or whatever agency you stole from or harmed in any way. But fees is another thing. So there's various kinds of fees you can incur. Probation supervision fees, so that's where you actually pay for being on supervision. There's different other fees as well, court fees, public defender fees. And a lot of these can be waived, but some of them cannot, and they can build up quite high. This is a pretty new topic in criminal justice that's getting a lot of attention, and we actually have a conference coming up in April about this topic specifically if you want to learn more about it. So one thing that is really different about Texas than in a lot of other places is that you can actually be revoked for not paying these fees. So you can be sent back to prison for not paying fees. This is from one probationer over here. He says, I have to pay about $260 every month. I don't even have a high school diploma, so it's hard to get a job. I work construction. I live on my own, have to pay bills. Sometimes I don't even have enough money to eat. So I actually want to go back here for a second to a slide I showed earlier. Oops, there it was. About the legal standard for revocations. And here specifically in Texas, if the violation is based solely on failure to pay, so they can violate people and revoke them solely based on the fact that they can't pay or that they haven't paid. So the evidence has to show that the defendant was able to pay and did not pay. So there is some sort of legal statute here that says they have to have some sort of determination to see whether or not the defendant is able to pay. And if they're not able to pay, they are not supposed to be able to revoke them. But the biggest problem I have with these kind of things, in my opinion, is that at some point you stop judging whether or not this person can pay. You know, if they make over $50,000 a year, you can probably guess that they can pay. Maybe they have a lot of kids they can pay. But at some point, when you're looking at their income and their expenses and their housing, at some point you stop judging whether or not they're able to pay, and you start making moral and normative judgments about the person and their lifestyle. Whereas, I have my probationer is smoking a lot of cigarettes. I asked him to stop smoking cigarettes in order to pay his supervision fees. Is that something you can ask somebody to do? I don't know. It's a pretty moral gray area, I think. But you can get into even more troubling areas, like that quote we saw from the probationer there, that he was paying $260 every month, and he wasn't able to eat sometimes. This is where you kind of get into this moral gray area where you can say they have enough money to pay, but do they actually? Or what is the kind of standard there? So in some instances, they are sending people back to prison for failure to pay, which is something I personally have a big problem with. So one also about fees and restitution. Officers regularly confront the issue of probationers being behind on fees. Actually, that top one, I missed that. Fees are necessary for probation to function. This is something that you see Not very often, but in Texas, and another county we looked at in Texas, Wharton County, about 75% of the probation department's funding came from fees that they took from supervision. So essentially, they're building their probation departments on the backs of poor people, in my opinion. So this is kind of a problem I have with the system. This is not something that we do in Minnesota, thankfully, and most other places in the United States do not do that kind of practice. But it is done in certain places. So there's some other things. Probation is a business. We need to keep the human piece in it. You wouldn't have a job if it weren't for the probationer. We need to treat them like a person with challenges and feelings. Each month, collections between sites are compared. So they actually compare the amount of money they're collecting from people between sites. So it's a bit of a troubling aspect there. Then we move on to sanctions. Graduated sanctions is something they use here in Bell County. They use it a lot of places across the country. So essentially, your first violation, you have one drug test failure, and they give you this sanction. You have a second one, they give you this other sanction. So it's kind of more times you mess up, the bigger your sanction gets. There's a lot of different opinions on this. Some say that it's a good system because it's a unilateral response. There's no room for biases or anything, simply based on what you've done. And then there's other thinking that it doesn't allow for enough human error. It doesn't allow for enough of the more social work, kind of working with the person, seeing what their situation is, and basing it on the individual. So there's a lot of different opinions on graduated sanctions and whether or not they work. It varies a lot between counties and even within a county. There are numerous alternatives to incarceration, though many gaps in available services and treatment still exist. So this is where they're talking about what kind of drug treatment facilities do they have, or chemical dependency treatments, domestic abuse treatments, those kind of programs. And they say that they have a lot of those, but there's still some gaps where people are not getting coverage. Actually, that's a good quote here from this probation officer. There's a lot of different opinions on how probation officers should function. There's kind of a more corrections-based approach where people see probation officers as an extension of law enforcement and the criminal justice system, where they should be catching people committing crimes and bringing them to justice for their crimes. And there's kind of this more social work type approach where they say that they should be trying to help these people rehabilitate and kind of desist from committing crimes. And so this probation officer here in Bell County says, I have been told that this is not social work, and I shouldn't spend more than 30 minutes with a person, but it establishes rapport and cannot be replaced. I need to get to know the person, but for some officers, this is just a job where they get cynical. For others, this isn't the case. If you don't care about the probationer, this shows through. So he's kind of showing that he wants to have this kind of more social work approach where he helps the probationers kind of get off of probation, but the department head, supervision, whatever, is telling him that he shouldn't be doing that. So motions, hearings, and revocations. Supervising officers file a motion to revoke as a last resort. This is what they told us, at least. This is just what we hear from them. The probation department's relationships with prosecutors and judges are generally good, so their goals do not always align. The revocation process varies in the amount of time it takes. This is something you hear a lot. Some people have a problem with revocation process in general because they are a pretty small minority of the amount of hearings that go on in the court. So a lot of times they'll have only one day a month or whatever that they end up going to court. So they get pushed back and pushed back. Sometimes they can take a long time, especially in small counties like this. All right, so now we can move on to Ramsey County, which many of you are probably more familiar with. So the Minnesota courts authorized to impose these following conditions. For felonies, they can go up to 4 years, or the maximum amount of prison term that could be for that sentence. Gross misdemeanors, such as a DWI or other driving offenses, can get up to 6 years. Gross misdemeanors up to 2 years, and all other misdemeanors are up to 1 year. This is again that chart where you can see the kind of variation that we have. So you have these statutes which apply to the entire state, but within the state you have a lot of variation in what actually occurs. And this is a lot of this is due to the fact that some of these states don't have many cases, so they have less experience. They don't. You can see this a lot in sex offenders. In some of the out-of-state places, you'll have their sex offense probation terms are up to 20, 30 years because they just don't have many. So when they do get one, they kind of have to. They don't really know what to do, essentially. But in some of these bigger counties like Hennepin, the largest county in terms of how many people they see, they've got quite a bit of experience. They know how they're doing it, so they've got lower probation terms. But it's also due a lot to what kind of crimes they have as well. For Ramsey, it's 72 months, 6 years.
That's felony probation, right? That's not going to be, just change the sentencing guidelines, Commissioner. I assume this is felony cases, right?
Yeah, this is felony cases. And this is just the average.
How would you explain this?
I can't really, to be honest. Yeah, it's just a different culture. You can see these couple of counties up here where it's really low all of a sudden. It's really dependent on what the culture is in those courts. We've been in both Hennepin and Ramsey. I can't say why that's such a difference, but it's a difference.
I wonder, in longer average, I know this is kind of a little different. And Ramsey is so much more in urban counties, it's much less suburban territory. I wonder if the racial demographics who ends up in urban courts are more white and yet shorter term.
I don't think their demographics are that different to account for, because I mean they're twice as high in Ramsey as it is in Hennepin. So yeah, but I can't say why it's such a huge difference. The one thing I've heard a lot of times is that since Hennepin has such huge case count, that they have so much more experience with all of these, every kind of case, that they kind of have figured out how to work.
And that's just the average term on probation, not the number of probationers themselves.
Yeah, this is the average term on probation. So how many months are they sentenced when they get felony probation?
That would interact with how many people are on roll. If people are staying longer, then you're going to have more people on roll.
Say that again? Sorry.
So if the terms are shorter, even if Hennepin has more people coming in, they're going to have fewer people than Ramsey would.
This is people sentenced from 2008 to 2012. So then, like if you were sentenced for 20 years, 10 years ago.
He's saying they cycle through more quickly though, because people get in, do their 39 months, get off, and then it would allow for more people to come in. The caseload.
Talking about how it interacts with a caseload.
Yeah.
Well, Hennepin has more people on probation than Ramsey in a given day. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but it's a couple thousand more for sure. And would this be comparable for actual jail time versus people that get probation, sentenced to probation versus?
For like, are you talking about in terms of?
What would be the rate difference between Hennepin and Ramsey?
In terms of sentencing for jail?
Right.
I'm not sure, to be honest. I would imagine it's probably fairly similar. I know Hennepin's a little bit more liberal in terms of their the judges and such that they have, the chief judge and stuff. So I'm guessing it's kind of a system-wide, kind of a little bit more, less punitive approach there. I would assume it's lower. Any other questions on that? All right. So then we look at kind of the same kind of crime rate comparison here. You can see that Ramsey is lower on murder. They are quite a bit higher on larceny and burglary again. Very high on auto theft. When you go to what kind of crimes are being put on probation, Again, you see it's a lot of drug offenses and a lot of DWI offenses, and you see those assault and theft offenses as well. And then we go to the risk assessment. Here in Minnesota, they use the level of service, case management, and inventory, the risk and the needs assessment. So investors, for the risk of reoffending, identifies their needs and analyzes their behavior changes. And then so they take that assessment score, their criminal history, their current conviction, and other things into account, and they assess them onto this risk level, risk assessment level. So you can see quite a number of them, 45% are on this high risk case, and which is higher than we saw in Bell County, but they're completely different risk assessment tools, so you can't really compare them that well. So here we have demographics. And when we looked at Bell County, we had overall adults on probation, and revocations. We didn't get that kind of data from Ramsey, so this is what we have. But you can see again, it's mostly young and disproportionately African American again, which is not surprising given the current state of the criminal justice system. So again, the legal context for probation revocations. Here in Minnesota, they have to consider something called the Austin factors when they're dealing with probation revocations. So before revoking probation, the court is supposed to specifically identify the condition that was violated, find that the violation was intentional or inexcusable, and find that the policies favoring probation no longer outweigh the need for confinement. And so here we have the same kind of thing that we saw from before, and here you can see that we have a lot fewer people being sent for over 6 months. We have a greater proportion who are being sent for less than 6 months. And if you look at these numbers, between the two, about 80% of people who go to these revocation hearings are being sent to prison. About 15% are being reprobated, few being dismissed. You can also see again the difference between technical and new crime. The new crime, if you commit a new crime, you're a little bit more likely to get over 6 months, but it's about the same for most of these.
I have a question about so if it's over a year, are you going back to prison, and under a year going to jail, or if you're revocated, you go right?
It's usually you go. Well, it depends. Most of the time, you're going right to prison. Even though you're sentenced, your new sentence is up. Yeah, I mean, it depends. It just depends where they're sentencing. So then we look at our qualitative analysis, looking at our interviews, about conditions. You hear kind of the same kind of things about conditions. There are too many conditions, and again, you hear that these conditions aren't individualized. They're just kind of have the set list of conditions that they're throwing at everybody. This is something we hear a lot. From one public defender, the conditions should be germane to the offense. It should be germane to the person's resocialization. I think by and large we have a lot of conditions here imposed upon people, and they might not have any real impact on the person's capacity to kind of walk the straight and narrow again. So I'm saying like they're putting these conditions on them, but they don't really have any effect or any indication of whether or not they actually want to desist from committing crime.
And are these conditions all coming from the judge?
Mostly it's in a plea deal. A lot of times, 97% of cases in the criminal court are argued by or finished by a plea deal. So most of the time it's kind of a probation officer can put in a little bit of input. The prosecuting attorney kind of throws what he wants out there, and public defender can argue a couple of them if he wants to, or the defense attorney. And then the judge signs the plea deal. And that's usually what ends up being on other conditions. And actually, one thing that we've heard sometimes is that the probation officers don't have that much of an input about what goes into that plea bargain. So they have their pre-sentence investigation is what it's called, where they meet with the defendant for a couple of hours and talk. That's when they do that risk assessment tool. But that happens after the conditions have already been decided, which is kind of a disparity there. What should be happening probably. So then we look at the length of probation. And this is where you can see that they had those longer sentences, and a lot of these people think that these probation sentences are too long. When we went in Hennepin County, a lot of times what we heard was that we think they're too long, but compared to other places like Ramsey, we don't think they're that bad. So you can kind of see there is some a desire to change those numbers that we saw earlier with that huge disparity between Hennepin and Ramsey. And early discharge is usually possible and can serve as an incentive for probationers. That's something we hear a lot. They want to do this kind of thing where if the probationer is doing well, they just get them off the caseload. That helps everybody in the system, is what they usually say. From one public defender, you can see this, where he's saying, actually the opposite is where he's saying that he can understand why there's a need for some of these 20-year probation sentences. And this is what you'll hear a lot of times, is that they're okay with these long sentences for second offenders. There's a lot of times what you'll hear. So fees and restitution, you can see there wasn't much to be said about this topic because it's just not as much of an issue here as it is in Bell County. Excuse me. So here the probationers have supervision fees, but they would not be violated for not paying them. So they wouldn't be violated for not paying them. One word of cautionary tale that I've heard from a public defender was that you might not be violated for not paying it, but if you have a program that you're supposed to go to, program's $200, you can't pay $200, so you don't go to the program, you could potentially be violated for not going to the program. That's a pretty kind of far-fetched way to get at that, but so it could happen technically, but they can't violate you for not paying supervision fee officially. There's one that down here at the bottom, you can see that it comes off of their taxes. It's pretty common across all of Minnesota. It's called revenue recapture. So if you don't pay, you file for your tax refund spring, it'll come out of there. Another thing actually that we've heard from some people, you might have seen there was a journal article about it, I think it was in the Star Tribune a couple months ago, that it won't come out as, you don't have to get violated for it, but there are other collateral consequences for not paying. If it goes to revenue recapture, you might have credit garnishments or other sort of kind of collateral consequences that happen to you financially because you have this coming out of your tax refund. So sanctions, in Ramsey, they also use the sanctions grid that we saw down in Bell County. It's a different one. There's lots of different ones across the United States. Sanctions grid is helpful for providing options and consistency. This is kind of the approach that I talked about earlier, where it eliminates the potential for bias. There are many alternatives to incarceration, but they are being underutilized. This is something we heard in Hennepin as well from some people. A lot of people say that, we're the Twin Cities, we have a lot of resources, we have a lot of treatment options. If you talk to people out of the state, they'll say the same thing about the Twin Cities. We have a lot of treatment options, but some of the people here think that they're being underutilized or there's still gaps in there somewhere. So motions, hearings, and revocations. Each party has a unique role in the revocation process. Revocations are generally used as the last resort after every option has been tried, and the decision to bring to court is an individualized decision based on the probation. And this is something you hear at every level of the criminal justice system. It's always got to be based on the individual. But you can still see these kind of generalities across all of them. Yep.
But how much latitude do the probation officers actually have? If there's outside of conditions, somebody violates on the conditions?
So they do have some discretion. They can decide whether or not to file a violation. The amount of discretion they have varies a lot, and some perceive that they have more than others. So that's something that's kind of hard to get at. We ask that question: how much discretion do you see you have? And you get a lot of. It depends on a lot of times the experience of the probation officer as well. If they're an experienced probation officer, they might know how to work the system a little bit better to kind of not necessarily violate for a condition or whatever. They can, in rare cases in some counties, I believe they can in Ramsey, they can go back to the judge and get conditions removed if they see them as as not pertaining to the individual. But it's a pretty rare process. It doesn't happen very much. And then there. And then quick thing about the beta phase. This is something that we're just getting started in. So this is something that we kind of wanted to do for a long time when we started, but you have to kind of go through all the beginning process to kind of get to know the counties first and everything. So you try to work with the jurisdictions to implement practices that can help them in any way. And you derive that information, derive what you want from the alpha phase. We're starting in Wharton County, Texas, and like I said before, they also have that similar problem with their fees, but that's actually something they don't want to work on. So that's an issue where, you know, we can only do whatever they want to do. We're working with them, so we're working on other things there, but probably not these.
Why are you starting there?
That was the first one we did. I don't know why they started there, to be honest. Just where you got the quickest response when we first started. And if you want more information and full publications, you can go to RobinaInstitute.org is the best place to go. The one on Bell County is on that website. Ramsey County, Wharton County will be up there a couple weeks probably. Massachusetts will be on there soon. There's a lot of other reports on there as well. Yep.
Did you examine any
We are starting in Marshall, in the Marshall DOC district, so there's Pipestone, Murray, some of the smaller counties down there that we're doing.
Do you plan to do any of the other countries?
No, not that I know.
Did you, were any of the alpha sites using a lying hope style sanctioning model? And if so, do you have any findings you'd be interested in sharing with us?
No, none of them use the hope style.
What is that?
Swift certain there.
Swift certain sanctioning is essentially a short period of incarceration for any violation of probation.
Yeah, that is something here that a lot of people want to experiment in. I think we might be trying to do something along those lines in Massachusetts or New York eventually. It's definitely something we should. And even if they might not necessarily be using hope style, you know, they might not call it that, but the idea of swift and certain is always there. Yeah.
I'm curious whether or not ranking status would be
Hopefully, yeah. The idea that we had was to have all these alphas and then get all of them into beta. But it depends on funding and all that kind of stuff, how long the Robina Institute will be around and all that kind of stuff. Yep.
I'm thinking going back to the qualitative discussions we had.
Mm-hmm.
Did you talk at all to any of the project that we had to do? I'm just wondering if those folks
I wasn't actually here when they did Ramsey. Ramsey was about a year ago, I think, when they were doing those interviews. I wasn't here during that time, so I don't know if they interviewed those folks. But we usually get some people who do recent investigations, but a lot of times probation officers do some of those. So we do hear from the people who are doing those investigations.
Organization might have, if there's two who are counties, you might have some observation.
What was that organization called?
You can still doing that, it's project for me.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So in the data phase, you're working with the alpha site for these performance measurements on influencing practices to improve outcomes like revocation and recidivism.
Yep.
Are you doing any analysis of like benefits to taxpayers or like cost analysis kind of thing?
We do some cost analysis kind of stuff. I'm not, and that's something we're still trying to decide. It depends on what we're working on in the counties too. You know, and if we're working on a sanctions grid, where how are they going to sanction their probationers? Stuff like cost analysis probably isn't as important, but if we're going to talk about fees and stuff like that, that's definitely something that's important. So what kind of analysis we do really depends on what kind of policies we're going to try to influence. Any other questions?
Well, thank you, Jason.
We have room until 2 o'clock. I'm sure that you have more questions. Or come on, we have the room until 2 o'clock.